At exactly 2:17 a.m. on August 9th, 2016, a white prison transport bus slowed to almost a crawl on a dark road just outside Atmore, Alabama. There were no sirens, no shouting officers, no warning. Inside the bus, more than 20 men sat chained hand to hand, ankle to ankle, their bodies stiff from hours of silence. The windows were covered with metal grates. The air smelled of sweat, rust, and fear. Nobody knew where they were being taken. They had been pulled from their cells hours earlier with no explanation, no paperwork shown, no chance to call home. Then the bus turned. Steel gates rose out of the darkness. One inmate leaned forward as far as his chains allowed and whispered words that made every man on that bus go still. "That's Holman." For a moment, even the guards stopped talking, because Holman Correctional Facility wasn't just another prison in Alabama. It was a place inmates talked about in low voices, the place officers avoided working if they could, the place where people were sent when the system decided they were no longer manageable. The gates opened slowly, screaming as metal scraped metal, and as the bus rolled inside, one question hung in the air, heavier than the chains around their bodies. Who decided these men belonged here, and what really happens when you're transferred to Holman? In Alabama, prison transfers are supposed to be boring. On paper, they look clean, organized, and routine. A few forms, a classification score, a signature from a supervisor. According to official policy, inmates are moved for safety reasons, overcrowding, or changes in custody level. Nothing dramatic, nothing personal. But inside Alabama's prison system, transfers don't feel routine at all. By 2015, Alabama was already facing a full-blown correctional crisis. Prisons were operating at nearly double their intended capacity. Violence between inmates was rising. Correctional officers were quitting faster than they could be replaced. Entire housing units were being run with only 1 or 2 officers at a time. At the center of it all was the Alabama Department of Corrections, known as ADOC. A doc controlled every movement an inmate made, from which dorm they slept in, to when they ate, to where they were sent when something went wrong. And when administrators felt a prison was losing control, transfers became their fastest solution. If an inmate fought, refused an order, spoke out, or was simply believed to have influence over others, his name could end up on a transfer list. Sometimes the reason was clear. Sometimes it was just one vague phrase typed into a system. Security concern. That phrase mattered, because once those words appeared, an inmate's life could change overnight. Transfers to Holman were rarely announced in advance. In most cases, inmates found out the same way. A cell door opening late at night, an officer reading a name, orders to pack only what could be carried, no explanation of where they were going, no timeline for how long they would be gone. Personal property often didn't make it. Legal papers disappeared. Family photos were left behind. Inmates later said it felt intentional, like the system was erasing their past before dropping them somewhere new. Restraints were applied immediately. Handcuffs, waist chains, leg irons. The tighter the custody level, the heavier the restraints. Conversation was discouraged. Questions were ignored. By policy, long-distance transfers were meant to happen during daylight hours. But many inmates transferred to Holman remember moving in the dark, between midnight and dawn, when other prisoners were asleep and the outside world wasn't watching. Former officers would later admit why. Night transfers reduced resistance. Night transfers reduced attention. Night transfers reduced accountability. The bus rides had lasted for hours. No bathroom breaks. No food. The temperature inside often swung between freezing cold and suffocating heat. Guards rarely explained where they were going, and when inmates guessed wrong, they were corrected with silence. For many men, hope lasted until the last turn, because Holman sits differently than other prisons. It isn't surrounded by towns or highways. It's isolated. Heavy fences stacked behind fences. Guard towers placed so every angle overlaps. From a distance, it looks less like a prison and more like a military compound. And everyone in Alabama's prison system knows what Holman represents. Holman houses Alabama's death row. It housed the state's electric chair for decades. It is designed for maximum control, not rehabilitation. Inmates sent there are labeled dangerous, disruptive, or unmanageable, sometimes without ever seeing a disciplinary board. By 2016, Holman had become something else entirely. It was a pressure valve when other prisons got too crowded. Inmates were sent to Holman. When officers lost control of a dorm, inmates were sent to Holman. When administrators feared unrest, inmates were sent to Holman. Transfers became less about behavior and more about containment. And once an inmate crossed through Holman's gates, getting out wasn't guaranteed. Some men stayed weeks. Others stayed years. Requests for transfer were ignored or denied without explanation. Families were rarely told why their loved one had been moved. From the outside, it looked like order. From the inside, it felt like punishment without trial. By the summer of 2016, the number of inmates being moved into Holman had quietly increased. Entire groups were transferred in waves. Each wave followed incidents that ADOC never fully explained to the public. And buried inside those transfer lists were names that would later raise serious questions. Men with no recent disciplinary history. Men who hadn't been charged with new offenses. Men whose only mistake may have been being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The night that bus rolled through Holman's gates on August 9th wasn't random. It was part of a pattern, a system under pressure, using transfers as a tool to regain control, no matter the cost. And what happened next inside Holman would push that system closer to the breaking point than anyone expected. Because once those men stepped off the bus and into intake, the rules changed. And not everyone would survive that change the same way. The first rule of Holman is simple. Don't ask questions. The men from the August 9th transfer learned that the moment their chains came off inside intake, orders were short, voices were flat. Nobody explained what would happen next. Names were checked against a clipboard one by one, like cargo being counted. This wasn't processing. This was sorting. Inside Holman Correctional Facility, intake wasn't designed to welcome inmates. It was designed to strip momentum. Men who arrived angry, confused, or still holding on to hope were slowed down on purpose. Every step took longer than it needed to. Every delay felt intentional. Shoes off, clothes off, hands on the wall. Strip searches were slow and exact. Any hesitation was treated as defiance. Any question was treated as attitude. And attitude at Holman had consequences. By the time inmates were issued new uniforms, most had already realized something was wrong. Their custody levels had changed. Men who had been classified as medium custody at their previous prisons were suddenly labeled close custody. That one change meant fewer privileges, tighter restraints, and far less movement. Some inmates were placed in segregation immediately, no explanation given. This happened fast. Too fast. Under ADOC policy, classification changes were supposed to involve reviews, documentation, due process. But Holman operated differently. Once you arrived, the assumption was simple. If you were sent here, you belonged here. No hearing, no appeal, no timeline. For inmates, that uncertainty was worse than punishment. Holman in 2016 was already unstable. Staffing shortages meant officers were rotating constantly. One shift enforced rules strictly. The next ignored them completely. Inmates never knew which version of Holman they'd wake up to. Tension filled the air. Rival groups were housed closer together. Dorms were more crowded than policy allowed. Lockdowns happened without warning and could last hours or days. When movement resumed, it was rushed and aggressive, as a control had to be reasserted every single time. And then there was a silence from the outside. Families often didn't know their loved one had been transferred until days later. Phone access was limited. Mail slowed. Visits were harder to schedule. For some inmates, Holman felt like being cut off from the world entirely. Former inmates would later describe the same feeling, being buried alive, but still breathing. In March of that same year, Holman had already made national news after a major disturbance drew attention to conditions inside. Federal investigators were watching. Lawsuits were building. A doc knew eyes were on them. Yet transfers didn't slow down. They increased. Inmates began to notice a pattern. Men who complained too loudly. Men who organized others. Men who refused to stay quiet when things felt wrong. Their names showed up on transfer lists shortly after. Holman became more than a prison. It became a message. This is what happens when you're seen as a problem. By late summer, whispers started spreading inside the walls. Guards were tense. Administrators were visiting more often. Paperwork was moving faster than usual. Something was building beneath the surface. Among the men transferred on August 9th was one inmate whose arrival didn't go unnoticed. Officers watched him closely. Other inmates recognized his name. He wasn't violent. He wasn't new to the system. But someone clearly wanted him here. And within days of his arrival, the atmosphere inside his housing unit changed. Lockdowns became longer. Searches became harsher. Conversations stopped when officers walked by. It felt like the prison was holding its breath. Because Holman wasn't just absorbing inmates anymore. It was bracing for something. And when the next incident happened, inside those walls, it would force questions that Alabama's prison system had been avoiding for years. Questions about why certain inmates were transferred. Questions about who made those decisions. And questions about whether Holman was being used not for safety, but for control. By the third week after the August 9th transfer, Holman no longer felt tense. It felt wired. Inmates could sense it the way animals sense a storm before it hits. Guards were jumpy. Count times were stricter. Movements that used to take minutes were now rushed or canceled entirely. Dorm doors slammed harder. Radios crackled more often. Something was coming. Inside the housing unit where several of the transfer men were placed, routines began to break down. Lockdowns stretched longer than usual. Meals arrived late and cold. Showers were cut short. Small privileges that inmates depended on, phone calls, commissary access, rec time, were quietly suspended. No explanation was given. For inmates, silence from administration was never a good sign. Among the transferred men was an inmate who had done time in multiple Alabama facilities. He understood prison politics. He knew when to stay quiet and when to pay attention. And he noticed something immediately after arriving at Holman. He was being watched. Not casually, not occasionally. Every time his dorm door opened, an officer's eyes stayed on him a second too long. During count, his name was checked twice. During searches, his bunk was flipped harder than others. When officers spoke near him, their voices dropped. It wasn't paranoia. Other inmates saw it too. In Alabama prisons, that kind of attention usually meant one of two things. Either someone thought you were dangerous, or someone thought you were influential. And influence scared administrators more than violence. Holman was already overcrowded. Staffing shortages meant officers relied on routine to survive their shifts. Anything that disrupted that routine, especially inmate communication, was treated as a threat. Transfers, inmates knew, were often used to break influence, move someone far enough away, place them in a harsher environment, strip them of connections. Eventually, they'd quiet down. That was a theory. But Holman didn't always work that way. The pressure inside the dorm began to build. Small arguments flared up faster than usual. Men snapped over trivial things, standing too close in line, sitting in the wrong spot, looking too long. Guards responded with forceful presence, not explanations. Then came the searches. Not routine shakedowns. Not random checks. These were targeted. Entire dorms were ordered to strip and stand against the wall, while officers tore through personal property. Mattresses were slashed. Legal papers were scattered. Family photos were stepped on. Anything that could be considered excess was confiscated. Inmates were told it was about contraband, but nobody found any. Instead, what the searches really did was send a message. You are not in control here. For men already shaken by sudden transfers, the effect was immediate. Voices dropped. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Trust between inmates began to crack. And that's when fear takes over. Inmates started whispering at night, long after lights out. They talked about why so many people had been sent to Holman so quickly, about whether the administration knew something they didn't, about whether another lockdown, or worse, was coming. Some believed AGOC was trying to preempt unrest. Others believe Holman was being used as a dumping ground to relieve pressure elsewhere. A few believe something darker, that certain inmates were being isolated on purpose, away from witnesses. No one knew for sure. Then one evening, during a delayed count, an argument broke out between an officer and an inmate in a nearby section. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it was public, and at Holman, public challenges could not be ignored. Within minutes, the entire unit was locked down. Doors slammed shut. Lights stayed on. Hours passed with no updates. Men sat on bunks, staring at concrete walls, listening to boots move up and down the tier. That lockdown lasted through the night, and when it finally lifted the next morning, one inmate was missing. His bunk was empty. His property was gone. His name was never mentioned. No one told where he went. That silence did more damage than any punishment could have, because now inmates understood something crucial. Transfers didn't end when you arrived at Holman. They continued inside it. Moved to segregation. Moved to another unit. Moved somewhere nobody talked about. And if you ask questions, your name might be next. The inmate who had been watched since intake felt it then, deep in his chest, that he was closer to the center of the storm than he wanted to be. Because whatever decision had sent him to Holman wasn't finished playing out. It was still unfolding. And the next move wouldn't come with paperwork, explanations, or warnings. It would come suddenly, just like the knock on the cell door that was already on its way. The knock came just before dawn. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, and that made it worse. In Alabama prisons, calm knocks mean paperwork has already been signed. The inmate sat up on his bunk as the door slid open. Two officers stood there. Neither explained why they were there. One simply read his name. The other told him to step out and cuff up. No warning. No chance to grab property. No explanation of where he was going. Other inmates watched in silence as the cuffs went on, then the waist chain, then the leg irons. No one spoke. Everyone understood the rule now. Watch, but don't react. He was walked down the tier, past faces that looked just as confused as he felt, past empty bunks that had belonged to men who were suddenly gone, past officers who avoided eye contact. This wasn't a transfer out of Holman. This was a transfer within it. Segregation. At Holman, segregation wasn't just separation. It was disappearance. Concrete cells, solid doors, limited light, minimal human contact, days that blurred together without markers. The reason for the move was never given. No disciplinary report. No hearing. No incident listed. Just a quiet relocation into deeper control. By the end of 2016, stories like this had become common across Alabama's prison system. Inmates transferred to Holman without clear reasons. Custody levels raised overnight. Men placed in segregation without formal charges. Outside the walls, lawsuits and investigations would later describe the same pattern inmates had lived through. Transfers used as management tools. Isolation used as leverage. Movement used as punishment. Inside the walls, inmates didn't need reports to understand what was happening. They felt it. They saw how quickly a name could disappear from a count sheet. How easily a person could be moved without explanation. How silence became policy. Holman wasn't just a destination anymore. It was a warning. And the truth is, many of the men transferred that were never told why. Some were eventually moved out. Some stayed for years. Some left Holman in ways nobody talked about. The system never announced mistakes. It never explained its decisions. It simply kept moving people. Quietly, efficiently, in the dark. The hidden truth about Holman Prison transfers isn't just about buses, chains, or gates closing in the middle of the night. It's about power. Who has it, how it's used, and what happens when no one is watching. In Alabama, transfers are supposed to be administrative, neutral, necessary. But for the men who lived through them, they felt like something else entirely. Decisions made far away, with consequences felt up close. Holman stands as more than a maximum security prison. It stands as a symbol of what happens when control becomes more important than clarity, and silence replaces accountability. And the hardest part is this. Many of the men who are moved there will never know the real reason why. No explanation will come. No apology will follow. No record will ever tell the full story. Because in a system built on movement and isolation, the most powerful weapon isn't force. It's uncertainty. And as long as transfers can happen without answers, without transparency, and without oversight, the gates at Holman will keep opening in the dark, and someone else will always be on the next bus.